welcome to the first program of this academic year for the Rutgers Center on Criminal Justice, Youth Rights, and Race. I'm Laura Cohen. I'm a distinguished clinical professor of law here at Rutgers Law School and also the director of the center. The center works to broaden understanding of and confront mass incarceration and structural racism within the American carceral state, and to promote meaningful, sustainable system change and abolition. To accomplish these goals, the center hosts relevant symposia like this one, conducts independent research and publishes reports and white papers, and participates as amicus curiae in criminal and juvenile appeals, raising issues of system-wide import. The center encourages student involvement in all aspects of its work, and for those of you who are students who are here, most notably, we have the Michael J. Sullivan Defender Fellowship, which supports Rutgers Law students who want to pursue a career in criminal or juvenile defense. We are so fortunate this evening to be joined by a trio of brilliant scholars and fierce advocates in this program that we have entitled Death by Incarceration. The question is, why the title? Over 200,000 people, or about 1 in 7 incarcerated people in the United States, were serving life or virtual life sentences in 2019. In New Jersey, approximately 1,100 people were serving life sentences with the possibility of parole in the same year, but 86 of those individuals are serving a sentence of life without even the possibility of parole. Countless others across the country and in New Jersey are serving extreme sentences that, in combination with the physically destructive conditions of confinement, the psychological and emotional tolls of incarceration, and the substandard health and mental health care provided to incarcerated people, effectively mean that they will die in prison. It is this hidden death penalty, as Pope Francis called it, that when he condemned the practice of life without parole, that we are going to reveal and discuss tonight. We also are going to shine a light of hope on the efforts that are underway across the country to reduce and protect people from the harms of incarceration as we move hopefully toward abolition of the carceral state in the United States. It's particularly apt for us to be having this conversation this week because next Tuesday, the New Jersey Supreme Court will once again take up the practice of life without parole for children who commit their offenses before they turn 18. This is the latest in a long series of cases involving this issue. The names of the cases that are being considered next week are State versus Comer and State versus Cerati, and many of the issues that we will be discussing tonight are also at issue in those appeals. Before I turn the program over to Jalen Porter, who along with Sarah Simon is a third-year student at Rutgers and one of the 2 2021 Michael J. Sullivan Defender Fellows, I'd want to just acknowledge the help and support of a few folks. 2 of them are 2 of the deans here at the law school, Rose Cuizon Viazor, who is our interim co-dean of Rutgers Law School, and Suzanne Kim, who is the assistant dean for academic centers. Thank you both so much for your support of the centers here at the law school. The wonderful and incomparable Habiba Johnson and Joe Nago, who are the brains behind this enterprise and provide all of our logistics support. And of course, Jalen and Sarah for all of the work that they've done in putting the program together. And then finally, of course, our speakers who Jalen will introduce. Finally, for those of you who are here for CLE credit, we will post the codes in the chat and we'll let you know as they come up. And so with that, I will turn the proceedings over to Jalen.
Thank you for that, Professor. So first, I would like to thank everyone for coming out. I know it's a Monday evening. A lot of people would like to take a break and get some rest. So thank you for attending our event. And so before we get started, I would like to introduce our amazing panelists. First, we have Professor Andrea Armstrong, who is the Law Visiting Committee Distinguished Professor of Law at Loyola University New Orleans School of Law, and author of Dying in East Baton Rouge State Prison. Professor Armstrong is a leading national expert on prison and jail conditions and is certified by the U.S. Department of Justice as a Prison Rape Elimination Act auditor. Professor Armstrong founded incarcerationtransparency.org, a database that provides facility-level deaths behind bars data and analysis for Louisiana and memorializes lives lost behind bars. Her research has been profiled by the New Yorker magazine and quoted in the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Public Radio, and among others. Her scholarship focuses on the constitutional dimensions of prisons and jails, specifically prison labor practices, the intersection of race and conditions of incarceration, and public oversight of detention facilities. Next, we have Sama Cesai, who is a Birth of Justice Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she specializes in international human rights and challenging inhumane immigration policies and abusive police practices. Prior to coming to the Center for Constitutional Rights, Sama worked as an Equal Justice Works Fellow at African Services Committee. During her 2-year fellowship, Sama provided legal representation on immigration matters to undocumented Black immigrant women, both transgender and cisgender, impacted by gender violence. Sama was born in Liberia and immigrated to the United States with her family at a young age during the country's Civil War. This experience informs her work as an attorney and propelled her to become the first person in her family to attend and graduate college. And last, but definitely not least, we have Zaire Yuri, who is a youth advocate and a credible messenger for the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Inside Circle Initiative. The Inside Circle Initiative is an organization that is dedicated to empowering formerly incarcerated people and building transformative environments for people impacted by the justice system. In addition to Inside Circle, Zaire is also engaged in youth advocacy in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now that I've introduced our panelists, I would like to turn it over to Professor Armstrong so she can kickstart the event.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me here. My name is Andrea Armstrong. I'm at Loyola University, and I am honored to provide the keynote and particularly inspired by the work of the students who made this happen. It's not often that people actually want to talk about what happens behind bars, and so I'm grateful for every opportunity. So what I'll be doing today is going through some research that I have done with my own students. And what we've been doing here in Louisiana as part of a class is collecting data on deaths behind bars through public records requests. And so what we're going to be doing is going through this data that they've been collecting and then connecting it and looking at what the implications are for the elderly and also for suicides. So first, we'll just talk a little bit about prisons. What's the difference, for example, between a jail and a prison, and why am I even talking about deaths? Second, we'll talk about the data that we actually collected and the ways in which we haven't been able to do this work before. And then third, we'll look at the implications that I just mentioned. So first, you can see two pictures, right? You see the picture on the top that says extended lockdown, and you see the picture on the bottom. But those are actually two different places, and the law treats them differently, even though they look really similar. So at the top, you're going to see prisons, and prisons are where people go who have been convicted of a crime and are serving a sentence that was set by a court. Jails, on the other hand, are locally administered carceral facilities, and those are usually for people who are being held pre-trial or they've been accused of violating their parole or their probation, and they're waiting there for a determination on whether they actually did or did not violate. Now, I bring up this difference in part because it pulls on different parts of the Constitution, but also because Louisiana is relatively unique in the United States in that 50% of our prison population is actually housed in a local jail. that has implications for their ability to access healthcare, for programming, or even for reentry types of training programs, such as vocational programs and high set exams. So this difference between prisons and jails is important, although I find it to be less so important in Louisiana and in a couple of other states as well. By and large, though, whether we're talking a prison or in fact a jail or a youth detention center or a civil detention space where we have a lot of people who have been accused of immigration violations being held, we know that these are secret spaces. These are spaces that the law protects, and where government power is at its highest authority and individual power is at its lowest authority. And so where we're in these spaces, there's this mismatch, and it's where people are uniquely vulnerable to government power. And so we can see that through a series of case decisions and laws that have basically shielded what happens behind bars from the public view. And that means that there is no right, for example, for the media to actually go inside and to interview people. There is no right, for example, to visitation or even into which facility you might be assigned to. There is no right for people who are incarcerated to organize or create petitions to improve conditions on their own. And because they don't have a constitutional right to that, it is even more incumbent upon people who were on the outside to demand the transparency and accountability of these jails, prisons, youth detention centers, and civil detention centers, because they are in fact operated in our name. Moreover, incarceration and what happens behind bars is also shielded because we simply don't talk about it when we talk about criminal justice reform. So I looked at criminal justice reform efforts across the country and in at least 30 different states. And what we see is that all of this criminal justice reform energy is either going to what happens before incarceration or after, right? And so we could think about reform efforts, meaning diverting people from entering in the first place, decriminalizing certain types of behavior. We can think about what happens on the back end in terms of reentry programming, paying attention to the very important collateral consequences that happen when someone has a felony conviction. But what we don't talk about is what happens in between those two things, as if prisons and jails are just a black hole in which people disappear and then reemerge to their communities and their families and their friends, as if that time just simply didn't exist. But we know it exists, and we know enough about the conditions, which raise the question of what are the ways in which that we can make the spaces and the treatment that people inhabit more humane and respects their basic human dignity. But even with all of that, you might be saying, well, why do you talk about deaths, right? So for the last 3 years, my students and I have been collecting death records. We get everything from the federal forms that they file. In some cases, we've gotten video or autopsy pictures. And I get asked the question a lot, well, why are you talking about deaths? And so I have 5 reasons that I think deaths are particularly important when we talk about conditions of confinement. The first is when our system sentences somebody to death, i.e. the death penalty, we have an elaborate procedure and process for how that happens. We have rules about what types of evidence comes into play. How do we weigh aggravating versus mitigating factors? We don't have that for the deaths that we've been examining here in Louisiana. None of the people were sentenced to death. Moreover, 14% of those who died were actually pretrial, meaning that a court had never determined their innocence or, in fact, their guilt. Moreover, when someone dies, our data doesn't show any correlation between the crime that they were convicted of, or that they were alleged to have done, and their actual penalty, meaning that death becomes a consequence of their incarceration, regardless of their moral liability, regardless of whatever they did or did not do in that particular situation. Second, prisons and jails are controlled spaces, meaning that they don't have vehicular accidents by and large, right? Because everybody's in one campus. There shouldn't be, but we know that there are deaths from drug overdoses because as a secure facility, there shouldn't be drugs coming in. And so we should see lower mortality rates in general when we think about prisons, jails, and other secured spaces. As I mentioned before, the third reason is that the people who are incarcerated are uniquely vulnerable. So first, they are completely dependent upon the administration of that system to provide basic necessities. They are not free to go and seek a second medical opinion if they get a diagnosis, or seek their own health care, or provide for their own meals other than what they can purchase out of commissary. And so in a lot of different ways, they are completely dependent on what the government does or does not provide. But second, we also know that incarcerated populations have significant high needs in terms of their medical and mental health care. And I'll talk about those details a little bit more when we get to Louisiana populations, including significant numbers who are on dialysis units or who have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder that requires prescription medicine. The fourth reason that we talk about deaths is deaths are expensive. They're expensive for the jails in terms of the healthcare that has to be provided, but they're also expensive in terms of insurance premiums. So we know this from our car insurance. If we have a lot of accidents, our insurance goes up. The same is true of facilities across the nation, but also legal liability. So for each of these cases, and even though the legal standards for proving wrongful death while incarcerated are exceedingly hard to meet, when they are met, that requires an additional payout. And therefore it's really expensive, and death should be avoided just as a matter of economic approaches, not to mention moral, legal, and political. Last, and as we'll discuss in a little bit more detail, the deaths that we see, particularly where we see certain patterns and trends, can be indicative of broader issues within that jail or prison. And so it's not necessarily about understanding what happened in one particular case, but also understanding that broader impact and what are the challenges overall when we require our jails and prisons to provide safe, secure, and humane periods of incarceration. So all of this data comes from our website, which is www.incarcerationtransparency.org. And what you can do there is you can play with the data. So in Louisiana, the only data that was available was from the US government, from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They would release their data often 2 to 3 years later, and it was not at the facility level, meaning that we would just get the data for our particular state. But that doesn't tell us, and what we actually discovered in our data is that some jails, in fact, have 0 deaths. Some prisons, for example, have relatively mild numbers of deaths, whereas there are other facilities that are far more deadly than their peers. And understanding that is helpful for advocacy to better understand which jails have these system-wide problems that are leading to deaths so that we can advocate on their behalf. And so BJS doesn't release the type of data that we need in order to make informed decisions about strategies, about advocacy, and indeed about reform. So we collected our own. So my students filed public records requests with 132 different facilities across the state. That includes every single juvenile detention facility, every jail, which is locally operated, our 8 state managed prisons, our privately operated facilities, including those facilities that are housing people for immigration violations. The data that I'm going to share with you does not reflect any of the data for people who are being held in a federal facility or necessarily on behalf of ICE. And that is because those Freedom of Information Act requests are still pending here 3 years later after we first requested them. We did get about 69% of response rates. And so the first thing we did was we tried to figure out who was dying and where. And so if you go to the website, what you'll see is a heat map. so that we can accurately know who is dying, where they're dying, and in fact, why they're dying. And you can find that out by parish, you can find that by facility, you can search by name. And so we put all of the data online, not just because we are not statisticians, right? We know how to work an Excel sheet, but with the hope that other people would be interested in this data set for future use and study. So who is dying? Well, what we know is that the most impacted group by far are Black men ages 55 to 60 who are serving convictions. That is 11% of all of the deaths. We know that on average, they are there almost 13 years before their death, but we also know that 26% of the deaths in our database over this 5-year period occurred within the first year of incarceration. We have deaths in our database that range from age 13 all the way to age 96. And it includes members of all races, it includes both genders. And in many ways, we found that our Louisiana data was actually very similar to some of the national data that we also see. And that includes understanding that medical illness is the leading cause of death behind bars, followed then by suicide. So the first thing that we wanted to look at is understanding race and how it fits into this. So in Louisiana, the population is approximately 1/3 African American. That being said, the state prison population is approximately 2/3 African American. And we see that disparity, that racial disparity in incarceration reflected in our deaths. And so when we look particularly at the leading causes of death, which are medical, what you see there is that 261 of those deaths were of individuals who identified as white, whereas 405 of those identified as Black. And just a caveat, although there are lots of different racial identities beyond white and Black, what we also learned in this data is that the Department of Corrections is not as great and does not have a systematic approach to identifying racial categories beyond Black and white. And therefore, that data is a little less stable when we look at other ethnicities and races. Across this, you can also see the different types of death and their prevalence, right? And so when we look at medical, we see that 87.75% of these deaths are due to medical related issues, but we also see that 3.5% over the 5 years was due to death by drugs, which is an increasing cause of death in almost every jurisdiction that I've reviewed data on. So a couple of things stand out at us. So first, we wanted to figure out deaths by trial status, meaning had they been convicted or not. The overwhelming number is convicted, but we also see that those are happening in pretrial for people who are still facing their trial. So that's 14% of the total are pretrial. But we also know Louisiana, as I mentioned before, that we have a rather unique housing system. And so people who were serving convictions, but in a local jail on this graph are counted as convicted. But what we'll see later is that approximately 25% of the total deaths occurred while incarcerated in a local jail. We also tried to examine looking at the type of facility and the average age of incarceration. And for us, this was something that was particularly telling. What we saw in the parish jails is that the age range skews younger than for all other populations, excepting, of course, juvenile detention, which only holds populations under the age of 18. And so when we think about parish jails, and that's there in the green, those are your locally operated carceral facilities, you see that the bulk of the deaths are actually at the age range of 37 to 42, whereas the largest for people who are in DOC custody, i.e. in a prison, it's 22%. And then the private deaths are kind of scattered around, and I wonder there if some of the numbers, because they house a lower level of numbers, but that actually reflects the trends that we should be looking for there. Because medical deaths are such a large part of the deaths here, I wanted to kind of lay out what the leading causes are. And here it is by far heart and cancer. But I want us to take this information in this context and think about it a little bit more deeply when we think about the elderly and think about pre-existing conditions. So one of the most interesting things that came out of our study is that only approximately half of the conditions are due to pre-existing conditions, i.e. a medical illness or diagnosis that the person received before they actually started their incarceration. And what that means for me is 50% approximately of the medical illnesses that lead to death for people behind bars are exclusively diagnosed and treated by the carceral healthcare system, meaning the healthcare that is provided by the jail or prison. This becomes even more meaningful when we think about the elderly within our prisons. And so we know that our prison populations in Louisiana are getting older. And that is in part a function of mandatory minimum sentencing, as well as life without parole sentences. But the average age used to be 36 5 years ago. Today, that average age is 40 years old. Moreover, the racial disparities that we see get even more or strengthened when we think about the length of the sentence. So the more punitive the sentence, the more likely there is to be a broader racial disparity. So if we think about the population of people serving life without parole, 73% of that population is Black. For our elderly population, they were 70% of the deaths behind bars. Moreover, 96% of these elderly deaths were deaths that were coded as medical illness. And this raises a couple of different issues. One, it forces us to rethink what is the purpose of incarceration. If the purpose of incarceration is to keep people safe, meaning on the outside to make sure that people who would create harm or violence are no longer present within the community, well, what we know is that the offending age tends to drop significantly after age 35. Meaning that the majority of people that we see in our prisons committed their crimes at ages 35 or less. Only 2.4% of the population in our prisons actually committed a crime or is serving a conviction for a crime committed after they were 55 years old. And yet we also know that they have higher medical needs and are uniquely vulnerable within these spaces. On average, they're serving approximately 16 years. That's their length of stay before their incarceration. And as I mentioned before, their healthcare matters. So here's a couple of pictures. So this is the medical room in a local jail. This jail closed in 2014, but it is literally one room. And this is the type of equipment you can provide. So I see a question about Louisiana data or national data. I'm talking exclusively about Louisiana data at this point. This is the main prison infirmary at Angola. And I want you to think about how much innovation happens every single year with medical issues, how we diagnose, how we treat. And yet our prisons and jails, our rooms look like they're from the 1970s. And we've seen reports, particularly here in Louisiana, of outdated equipment that is expired or not functioning, which creates problems for the effective delivery of care. When we think about our elderly populations in particular, we also know that they are uniquely vulnerable. And so when I reviewed several state prisons, those are their acronyms there. So Allen Correctional, Dixon Correctional Institute, Raymond Laborde Correctional Institute. And there we're finding some interesting needs. And it's a valid question on whether prisons and jails are actually the best providers of the healthcare needs that we see in these populations. Thinking about dialysis units, qualifying for a medical diet, which makes sense given the prevalence of heart disease within these populations. When we think about LCIW, which is Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, at that point, there was 50% of those women had a mental health prescription. We also know that there's a significant proportion of the population with hepatitis C. When we talk about the race and age profile of pretrial deaths, the 14% is our Louisiana numbers. That was a question in the chat. But 14% was our Louisiana pretrial deaths. So within this context of high needs and understanding the prevalence of medical illnesses, particularly for elderly populations within our prisons and jails, there's a number of challenges that people face in accessing adequate and appropriate healthcare. The first is just access. Everyone has a copay. So there's a medical copay, which is $3. But when you take that $3 and you multiply it by 2 cents an hour, which is the most prevalent wage for field work if you're incarcerated, that works out to a copay of $1,087 just for your one sick call visit. Moreover, they don't have the opportunity for preventative health visits, or what we might call well visits. Those only start after age 40 for people who are incarcerated. When we think about the delivery of services, we saw issues in terms of the providing continuing care and chronic care and specialty care, meaning that in some cases, there will be a specialist that has to provide that care outside. And then it's the jail that is responsible, or the prison that's responsible for getting the incarcerated person to that healthcare appointment. And what we found is only 50% of those specialty consults were being completed in a calendar year. Last, in terms of administration, we know that there are problems. It's been documented here in Louisiana, as well as in other states, where prison systems can hire medical providers who do not have unrestricted licenses, meaning these are individuals who are prohibited from practicing in community. So they could not be my doctor and they could not be your doctor, but they are allowed to practice in quote unquote institutional settings, which as a practical matter works out to be prisons and jails. When they're allowed to practice under these limited means, they are supposed to be supervised, highly supervised. All of their reports, diagnoses, periodically reviewed by someone who has a free license or an unrestricted license. And what we saw is that not only were the majority of doctors had some issue with their license, but second, that they also were not being adequately supervised. All of this leads to situations like my friend Glenn Ford. So Glenn was on death row for 29 years. He was wrongfully convicted and he was released. And when he was released, within 1 month, he got a diagnosis of terminal cancer. And he actually only enjoyed 15 months of freedom before he eventually died of cancer. And he would talk about what are the things that he thought made him sick. Part of what he blamed was certainly the healthcare system that was available. He said that they would give you Thorazine or Tylenol and nothing in between. But part of it was also the space in which he lived. And so it's not just healthcare systems that we have to pay attention to. It's actually the entire environment. And this can bring in environmental justice advocates. Things that he talked to me about, nutrition and the availability of healthy diets, particularly given the heart disease and the medical needs of elderly people. Temperature controls, heat can interact with your medication and can increase your vulnerability to other types of second order effects. Toxic exposures, lots of prisons and jails, they may be built in areas or parcels of land that are less valuable, where there may be near Superfund sites, or they may face hazardous conditions from smoke or other types of toxins, airborne toxins, and also waterborne toxins. Last was the ability to go outside. And so one of the things for Glenn, you can see on the left, he didn't go outside for the last 7 years of his incarceration on death row because he said it looked like a dog pen and he refused to be treated like a dog. So on the left, what you see is the space where people who are in solitary or on death row would exercise at Angola. Looks really similar to another prison that I visited in Norway. The ability to be outside, to get fresh air, to get vitamin D from the sun, all of that is part of health And so we have to think beyond our healthcare systems to think about healthy environments. But this also helps us think about solitary populations who are also uniquely vulnerable to these challenges. So what we know is that there's approximately 55 to 62,000 people who are in state prisons who are serving, who are in solitary confinement. And solitary confinement takes a lot of different definitions, but one definition is 22 hours or more in a given day without meaningful contact. And I think the hours is difficult for us to wrap our heads around. And instead, I prefer to think about it in terms of extended periods of time without meaningful social interaction. Note that this number also does not include jails. And so solitary is solitary, right? That's it on the left, looks similar, although with a few more amenities than you would think about than on the right, which is what solitary looks like in Angola. But we also know that solitary will often include people who have mental health challenges. And thinking about how our healthcare systems fail to provide care for people in solitary is specifically important. We also know that solitary confinement also disproportionately impacts Black populations when we think about prison. So even when we control for the racially disparate incarceration rates, when we then look at who is in solitary, we see that it is racially disproportionate for African Americans. And those two latest studies come from important work that the Lyman Center at Yale University has been doing, looking at solitary and working to document the use of solitary across the United States. With that context, I think it's really important for us to understand what solitary looks like. And so here is just a brief clip of some isolation cells at a jail, so you can get a sense of what they look like.
This is an isolation cell.
So the sound is not necessarily important, but it's a row of 5 cells.
Door.
And that is the entire isolation cell for one person. The sound, the steel door means that sound doesn't permeate, right? It also means that it's impossible to connect. You can't see what time it is. You can't see what day it is, depending on how long you're in there, and you have no control over lights or temperature. For psychiatric units, the cells look in fact the same as other cells. So you've got a 2-person bunk. It's a 6x10 cell. You have your toilet, and that is the extent of the cell that you would use. These are also all on its tier, such that it's impossible for supervision, particularly when we think about suicide. Coming towards the end, thinking about suicide rates and the death data that we found in Louisiana, we found a surprising number of deaths were occurring in solitary conditions. So solitary is supposed to be one of the most regulated and most observed spaces within a prison or jail. And yet, even with all of these policies and practices in place, we know that people are completing suicides, particularly in jails, in these segregation spaces, rather than what you can see for the DOC, which is that these suicides are spread across the different locations. So here we have 43% of suicides that occurred in a parish jail happened in a segregation space. Even more troubling is of the 4 that we saw in juvenile facilities, 67% of juvenile suicides occurred while in segregation. We know that the average age for these deaths is far younger than for medical illnesses. We know that on average, it's about 5 years. And here is one way in which we don't see a disproportionate impact on African Americans. Here it's 43% Black for Louisiana data and 51% white. And then last, we see that it is happening almost equally between convicted populations and pretrial populations. So I want us to think about all of these things in context, the ways in which death occurs, right? So part of it is the failing of the body. It can also be part of the failing of the mind and the ways in which we degrade people when they're behind bars. So on the top, you'll see a really creative solution by people in the jail, which is they had no place to put a toothbrush. And so, and they needed a clean place to put it. So they carved holes in walls to hold their toothbrushes. The bottom is the masking tape that's used to label them as they go forth, back and forth to court. But I also think that we really need to be radical in how we reimagine what these systems look like. So on the top is just piles and piles of jumpsuits, just waiting for the next inhabitant. And on the bottom is the toothpaste. It's toothpaste on the bottom of a bunk. And what this person was putting was a calendar, trying to keep track of the days, trying to make one day look different from another day. And so in this context where people lose all sense of time and of space, where they're in unhealthy environments and uniquely vulnerable to death, I think it's important that we, as people who are outside and free, advocate and demand improved transparency and accountability for prisons, jails, juvenile detention centers, and our civil immigration centers. With that, thank you very much. And I'm excited to take any of your questions, the ones particularly that I might have missed in the chat.
Thank you for that presentation. So we have one question in the chat. It's from Jennifer, and she's asking, are folks giving a medical examination when they are initially incarcerated? I imagine there are lots of folks who do not have access to regular medical care before prison.
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. Medicaid expansion has significantly improved the access of individuals in those states that have adopted it. And we've seen that here in Louisiana with Medicaid expansion. But when you enter, most jails will have some sort of intake. I would say the health assessment intake at prisons is far more robust. Up until the 1990s, the New Orleans jail didn't even have a permanent health director or have a doctor that was full-time on staff. And so all of this is relatively new, but those health assessments may be relatively minor. Maybe tell us what you got, right? It's not a top to bottom assessment. There's no blood labs that are done. They will test you for, TB. I think HIV, AIDS, if you're willing to be tested for that, as well as coronavirus now. But that's it.
Thank you. And it looks like we have another question in the chat from Virginia, and they're asking about the breakdown of pretrial deaths.
Yes, sorry about that. So, so pretrial deaths in what way? So, are you interested in the kind of racial breakdown? Or, I mean, we also see for the demographics by age and race. Okay, so for the pretrial deaths, what we know is that the age is generally lower than our average age. And there, what you're seeing is predominantly in that 37 to 47 age range is where the bulk of the deaths are located. When we think about race, we see the same numbers as we did for the broader population. So approximately 60% African-American, 40% white. Trying to think, breakdown by race and age for pretrial deaths. I think that's all of them. And again, we also don't see correlations between the crimes that they're alleged of committing and their actual death rates. So for example, in Louisiana, the East Baton Rouge Parish Prison, which I had reported on earlier for deaths 2012 to 2016. At this point, since 2012 to present, we're looking at approximately 46 deaths that have occurred. And there we have a couple due to violence, but the majority are due to medical illness. And then we have a series of suicides and drug overdoses as well. And then I believe I was asked for an email address, or at least perhaps, and my email address is armstron@loyola.edu, and I will put that in the chat as well. Thank you for your questions.
Yes, thank you again for that powerful presentation. Now, keeping in mind of the time, we'd like to move on to Sama. And if you have more questions for Professor Armstrong, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll answer them when we conclude our Q&A session. So Sama, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Rutgers Center on Criminal Justice, Youth Rights, and Race for putting together this important discussion and inviting me to speak. As Jalen mentioned in my intro, a lot of my work at the Center for Constitutional Rights focuses on ending criminalization and incarceration. Some of this work focuses on conditions in local jails where ICE contracts to hold immigrants facing deportation. And this is something people often don't think about when we talk about mass incarceration and the impact of incarceration on individuals. But today I'm going to be talking specifically about CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights work in Pennsylvania in a case called Scott v. Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole. I'm going to drop a link for folks to read up more about the case and some of our clients because I will not be sharing my screen, I'll just be talking. So Scott is a case that CCR has brought along with our partners in Pennsylvania, Abolitionist Law Center, Amistad Law Center, and the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration. And it's a lawsuit that challenges Pennsylvania's mandatory sentencing scheme as unconstitutional and cruel punishment as applied to individuals who are serving life without parole for felony murder. However, as the case clearly states, we do not call it life without parole. We call it death by incarceration because we think that is a more appropriate term for the sentences that people are serving. Abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmer says abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And we know that there's nothing life-affirming about prisons. As Professor Armstrong spoke about, the healthcare system, nutrition, the entire environment makes prisons death-making institutions. And so when we're talking and advocating against these things, we need to really state that. So people are not serving life without parole sentences, they're serving death by incarceration sentences. And that's what this case really focuses on. So like I said before, the case is really challenging a specific code within the parole code in Pennsylvania that prohibits people who are serving DBI, death by incarceration sentences, from being considered for release on parole, which is why we specifically sued the Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole. And we assert that the prohibition on parole is as applied to our clients who were convicted of felony murder, which essentially we define as crimes in which they did not take or did not intend to take a life, goes against the 8th Amendment principle of cruel and unusual punishment. And we really build upon, I'm not sure how many folks have taken 8th Amendment law, but we really focus upon like the line of cases that arise from death penalty, some state and federal death penalty cases, and especially on Miller v. Alabama, which addresses juvenile life without parole or death by incarceration sentences, in which a lot of these courts, what they're doing is saying that certain categories of people with diminished culpability, so for instance, in Miller, children, or for instance, in other cases, people with intellectual disability, should not be sentenced to certain schemes, whether it's actual death penalty or life without parole, death by incarceration, because of this diminished culpability. And so we follow similar arguments line in this case around the Pennsylvania Code. So why is this so important? Why are we focusing on Pennsylvania as opposed to other states? because Pennsylvania has the second highest number of people serving these sentences in the United States. It's a complete outlier in the United States and especially in the world. More than 5,200 people in the state of Pennsylvania are serving sentences of death by incarceration. And of this population, more than 1,000 of these people are serving this sentence for felony murder, right? And although Black people only make up 12% of Pennsylvania's population, nearly 70% of those serving DBI sentences for felony murder are Black. And so this desperate impact is just very, very clear. And it's also important because as Professor Armstrong was talking about the aging population of people who are in prison, what we see with this population is that a lot of individuals in Pennsylvania who are serving DBI sentences were initially sentenced when they were really young. So the average age is, let's say, 25. And right now, or they were 25 or younger when they were originally sentenced to to DBI. And now most of them are well into their 50s or 60s. So what we're talking about is an elderly Black population serving these sentences in prison, and who, if not released, we know will die in prison because of the conditions, and will most likely die earlier than they would if they had not been in prison. So for example, the lead plaintiff in our case, her name is Marie Scott. She's a Black woman who is 67 years old and has been incarcerated for more than 47 years. Ms. Scott is a survivor of repeated childhood sexual abuse and physical abuse. She was arrested when she was 19 years old for her role in a robbery in which her co-defendant killed the victim. And Ms. Scott was convicted of homicide, of felony murder, and given a mandatory sentence of life under the scheme that exists in Pennsylvania under the parole code. This filing is really just a part of an ongoing abolitionist effort by our partners in Pennsylvania, as well as a national effort to release individuals from all forms of incarceration. Countries around the world, like I said before, have long recognized that prolonged and mass incarceration serve no legitimate public purpose and is inherently cruel and dehumanizing. Another example, two of our clients, the Evans brothers, Reed and White Evans, were convicted when they were 19 and 18 years old, respectively. They were part of a robbery in which they had and showed a non-operational shotgun while committing a robbery. And they dropped off the victim after the robbery, and a few hours later, the victim died from a heart attack. And so the prosecutor's office charged them with murder, felony murder, because of the death that occurred or that was related to the commission of the felony, the robbery. And they served over 40 years in prison. However, there is some good news in this, and I think this will explain some of the system also in Pennsylvania, is that the Evans brothers were actually released from prison in February 2021 under commutation from the governor's office. And I'm going to explain that a little more and why that's important to all of this. And so here you have people, two Black men, two brothers who were involved in a robbery, their first offense when they were 18 and 19 years old, served over 40 years, and were released at 58, 59 years of age, respectively, from prison, basically serving most of their adult lives because of this scheme. So, like I was saying before, I think what's really important about Pennsylvania and why this case and what we're doing trying to challenge this parole code is really important to the people who are currently serving DBI sentences, is because Pennsylvania has a very, very strange clemency process. So clemency is the process by which anyone who's serving a DBI sentence could possibly be released early, right? So it's not parole, it's a discretionary system that oftentimes in many states, the governor has sole power over. So for instance, in New York State, you will apply, to the governor's office for commutation. That could be clemency, or that could be a pardon that you would apply to the office for, and the governor would review applications. And every year, governors usually will commute certain sentences. And that's essentially how people who don't have a chance at parole or don't have a chance at other things are able to get out of prison early. In Pennsylvania, the scheme is that there's a board of pardons, which means that there's a 2-level process before someone can even be considered for a commutation, right? So there's a board of pardons that is made up of 5 people, and they have to decide first that this person could qualify for a commutation. Then they send it to the governor, and then the governor would have to sign on to it. In the past, commutations were actually pretty regular in Pennsylvania, and people would be told by their lawyers, you get a life sentence, we're really sorry this happened, just keep your head low in prison, have good behavior, and in a few years you can apply for commutation from the governor's office, and hopefully you would be released that way. However, things changed in Pennsylvania. There was a situation in the 90s where an individual, a man named Reginald Mcfadden, was released under a commutation from prison in Pennsylvania. And after he was released, he killed more individuals after he was released. And what we saw after that was that, along with the tough on crime mentality that we saw in 94, 96 onward, was applied to Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, previously, you just needed a majority of the pardon board to approve your pardon for it to go to the governor. Now you need 5 out of 5, right? So that's unanimous to individuals within the pardon board to approve your application before it goes to the governor, right? And so essentially what this means is that very, very, very few people are actually being released early, and a lot of individuals are dying in prisons in Pennsylvania. There was an American Life article done on this, and I'm going to drop the link for that if folks are interested and listen to it later. It focuses on the daughter of one of the women who was harmed by Mcfadden after he was released, and also talks about, again, this idea of redemption and what it means as someone who was like a victim's advocate to now look at where Pennsylvania is now because of this case, and some of the work that she's been doing to try and actually fight for the release of people. So you all can definitely listen to that when you have time. Yes, so essentially there's a mass campaign happening, not just in Pennsylvania, but around the country, to really bring light to the conditions that people are facing in prison. I think there has been a slow but strong recognition in the United States that the death penalty, like the state actively killing someone, is wrong, and a lot of states have been moving away from it, though of course it still exists in the United States. And however, what we're trying to bring attention to with this case, and with a lot of advocacy that our partners are doing, is to say it's more than just the state actively killing someone through the death penalty. Here are the ways that prison, like just being in prison for an extended period of time, leads to death, right? And we really need to think about that and think about what it means to fight for people to be released, to fight for people to not be incarcerated in the first place, to fight for the root causes of why a lot of individuals end up in prison, and to really embrace, as we claim our system does, ideas of rehabilitation and redemption, especially for elderly folks who are still serving sentences. So I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you all.
Thank you again, Sama. Thank you for your advocacy efforts. It's definitely a case that we all should keep our eyes on. And so now I would like to give the floor to Zaire. Zaire is formerly incarcerated. He's gonna share his experience with us. So the floor is yours.
All right, how you doing, everybody? So I want to speak on incarceration. So when I first got incarcerated, I was 13 years old. I was serving a 10-year sentence for first degree felony murder, and just having experience with the judicial system, it wasn't kind of good because I was getting myself into the worst situations at a young age, and I just felt as though when I was sentenced, it was understandable, but it was also harsh because at that age of 13, I didn't really know what the judicial terms were, but also just having a mindset of not knowing what was going on, just me getting sentenced. I kind of acted out in anger, because of the simple factors though. Like I said before, I thought I wasn't gonna never come home when I heard 10 years. But as my time being incarcerated, I really didn't have that much support. My mom was handling my sisters. So the focus wasn't really on me. As long as I knew that my family was good, I was kind of grateful for that. But in the midst of me being incarcerated, it was kind of hard because, like I said, once I got sentenced, I just thought that everything, all hope was giving up for me. So I acted out in violence. I took it out on others which I felt as though was not necessary for me to take it out on people, because of the simple fact as though it was wrong for me to make those harsh decisions. Being who I was and where I was from, and how I represented myself. But as time went on, I just felt as though enough was enough. I was recently, what actually really made me change, I was sitting in what everybody would call segregation unit, like isolation unit, for 3 months. Normally, you're supposed to be in there for a couple of days, maybe a week, but they felt as though that I wasn't, able to leave because they didn't know, my everyday move. They was kind of skeptical, on, releasing me to population. So once I felt that, me being in that small cell, just a blanket, no time, no nothing, no mail, nothing. It was kind of frustrating for me, and I just felt as though enough was enough. I can't keep doing this for the rest of my life. And I was probably about 16, saying that, going on 17. So I found ways on how to eliminate, my encounters with others. I started off excluding myself away from my peers. I just tried to do it every day. I just tried to be different every day. It was hard, spending 8 years in prison. So it was I tried to find every day something to do differently. And that was my goal. My goal was, if I woke up and did this on a Monday, if I wake up on a Tuesday, what can I do different from Monday? And it actually helped me a lot because I actually bought myself out. And what I mean by bought myself out means that I found who I really was, by myself being incarcerated. I found the passion of cooking. I was in a lot of seminars, as time went on, as far as me transitioning. And it was kind of hard to convince people that, I was trying to transition in my life because, like I said before, of what I came through and what I've been through, they wasn't too really, lenient on me like that. But I had to prove to them and I had to show them, that, like I said, enough is enough. I was willing, to make every situation different. I was willing to do everything, completely like the opposite of what I was. So, in order for me to do that, I had to find ways. So I took up college classes. I found like little like programs, in there as far as aggression replacement training. I did mental health. I also did substance abuse. I did NA. So for me, I felt as though if I had those basic goals down pat, as far as achieving those, I could achieve anything else. So like I said, I did college classes, and so probably around when I turned turning 18, I felt as though like, all right, you know what? I want to put in the process of a recall. And process of a recall. And what I did was, I just tried to do better. I tried to find things to do. I was also getting the support, from a lot of people, to reach out to me and get what I need to get done. And even though it was like obstacles that was always, being encountered, but I managed to pull through. And by me pulling through, I was given an opportunity, to be back in society, and for me being back in society, I just felt as though it was only right, yeah, I don't mean to cut myself off, but I wanted to time back. By me being in prison, I forgot. What really played a good part of my life was the inside circle. Coming to New Jersey, like boarding town, the prison I was in, because of the simple fact is though, inside circle was, a group of guys that I could relate to, that was in the same situation I was, or even worse, or just being encountered with the prison system. They also helped me a lot in finding out who I was and what I was about and how to make it better, So I've been with the inside circle since I was incarcerated, and by me transitioning, me given the opportunity to be released from boarding town, I was recently transitioning myself to the state of North Carolina, and I just felt as though, right, in order to being a better person, in order to change your surroundings and your lifestyle, I felt as though you had to change your environment. I felt as though my environment was the main key in my success, which I'm about to explain to you now, because of the simple fact is though, it was kind of rough growing up in the streets of North. I've been through it a lot, running the streets, and I just felt as though by me transitioning myself to the state of North Carolina, it was kind of like a vacation for me to slow down, so I came home, moved with my aunt to Raleigh. The first week I came home on a Friday. That Monday I had 2 jobs lined up for me, working at a simple fast food restaurant. I was working at McDonald's, and if y'all don't know, it's called Bojangles. So I was currently working there for almost probably about 3 months, 3 months in. And basically I just tried to find ways on doing things productively in my community. And I felt as though by me coming home, doing a long sentence, I just felt as though that was my testimony, my testimony to, show the world and my family members, and people that didn't have interest in me, that, I'm not the same kid that I was when I was 13. Now, currently, I'm 23 now. Like I said, I was working at McDonald's and Bojangles. Then I moved up slowly but surely, I started working at Wingstop, I don't know if a lot of people know what Wingstop is. Wingstop is a a wing restaurant. So I worked myself up from being a crew member, from washing dishes, taking out the trash, just delivering orders. And then I moved up slowly but surely. I became a shift lead. And probably a couple of months in, I became a shift lead. I started learning on ways on how to, manage my anger, but also communicate and also grow healthy relationships with my coworkers, because I didn't know how to interact with a lot of people, like in a way. But I became a shift lead. Then, I moved up. I became a manager, and then that's when I decided to move to Charlotte, to pursue my career, because I wanted to further my career in, working at Wingstop, working at a business, a corporate business at that. So I moved to Charlotte. I became a manager there. And as time went on, I was just trying to find ways on, how to be productive, how to be professional, how to, carry myself, how to come to a meeting presentable. And also the inside circle helped me with that a lot. It actually helped me with everything that I encountered, everything that I overcame, everything I accomplished, my goals. And then they was also they was helping me on how to become a good manager, and that played out very good. And then as soon as you know it, I bumped up, became a general manager. Actually come from working as a crew member to actually run a restaurant within a year of my time being home. Within a year, and by me becoming general manager, it was like, all right, this is the next step right here. So I had to figure out how to handle it, because even though it was too good to be true, too exciting, I also still had to slow down and basically understand, the basics of it. And by me becoming a general manager, it was actually kind of grateful, kind of good. I had fun doing it. Just supervising others, like learning a goal, and basically I just felt as though, I wanted to learn a different trait. I wanted to learn a different skill. So I was just finding ways on looking for a different job, a different. So what I did was I did 2 years of working for Wingstop. And when I put in my 2 weeks notice, everybody was kind of upset that I was leaving. But, I did my part. I did my duties. I helped out as much as I can. Even when I stopped working there, I was still helping out. But when I chose to choose a different route, I chose labor over, sitting at a desk, sitting at an office, because I felt as though, I wanted to get back in a good physical aspect, So I started working for FedEx, and now I'm currently working for FedEx. But just to transitioning from, me being incarcerated to me being home, I felt as though, by me changing myself and changing my environment, I felt as though I needed to speak to others. I needed to speak to kids that was in a predicament as me, to, get them on the right track, or just even help out. Like on my days off from work, I work with a group of kids, I keep them off the streets. I help them set up bank accounts, so they could be, successfully. I show kids, just the basics, like, how to manage your money, time management, working at a job, how to be presentable, how to come to a meeting. If you're doing an interview, how you're supposed to present yourself, from resumes to just the little things. If you need, cosmetics, clothes, shoes, whatever, on my day off, I actually drive them around. I don't get paid for nothing. I felt as though, that's just my testimony. My testimony is, to show others, the things that I overcame and the things that, I felt as though need to be right. And I currently do this till this day, and I'm going to continue doing it because this is my success. And I get a lot of comfort out of, having feelings for others, and, being a model citizen, which I'm trying to be, but I just want to thank everybody, just for hearing me out, listening to me. And I just want to thank, people that's been there since day one, my supporters, people that help me out. And I also want to thank the kids that I work with for letting me work with them, because I see that, by me not having help growing up, like I had my mom to raise me, but, like far as not being in the streets, but like outsiders, I didn't have that help. So for me to have outside help to help others, is kind of a blessing. And I just want to thank everybody for hearing me.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. We all appreciate it. And we're all rooting for you. And so thank you again. And now we have about 7 minutes. We can conclude with a short Q&A session. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And so if you have any questions for any of our panelists. We have one question from Jennifer for Zaire, and she wants to know, what were some services you thought would have been helpful to you while you were incarcerated?
Some services. Honestly, I feel like it should have been a lot of, services implemented for not just me, for a lot of people, because, being incarcerated, first you gotta have a mindset of change, and having that change, that breaks down far as choices. You need to, make certain choices, and if you really want it to be successful, you gotta grab it, you gotta chase it. And honestly, I feel like it should have been more, things being implemented in there, like far as, like more college classes, like instead of like, how can I put it? How can I explain it? Instead of having just disciplinary hearings, I feel like for a disciplinary hearing, I feel as though, it should be investigated, because it's like in the prison systems, like being an inmate, your word do not like count, and it's hard to say that because, it is the truth, but I feel like every voice matters, even, like, cause some people, honestly, I was a paralegal in there. I was a paralegal there, and basically like looking over some of those cases that got in trouble. When they got in trouble, it was understandable, if they did it or not, and basically like when you encounter with certain, racism in there, it's kind of hard battling that. You can't just be like, all right, you know what, this guy was actually being racist to me, and I didn't have no choice. I didn't do nothing wrong, but I just said what I had to say. They don't look at that. They look at it, all right, you're being wrong, you're being rude, you're being disrespectful, so here comes the disciplinary hearing. I feel like that right there is not fair. And another things too, I feel like it should have been like more incentives, more jobs for kids, more programs like trades for kids to take up. Because honestly, I was probably one of the only kids and a few other kids that literally was begging like the superintendents and them, like to get us resume writing classes, just taking regular like pre-101 math and English classes for college. You know, just how to be presentable and stuff like that. You know, it was hard reaching that because of the severity of how they felt as though we were. And I felt as though that was actually kind of wrong for that. But, you know, like I said, everything that I accomplished, you know, I tasted. And I feel like, you know, if kids want to accomplish and want to be on the right track, they got to have that mindset of, all right, I might go through obstacles, but I'm going to overcome it. You know, a lot of kids, they go through an obstacle and they break down. You get what I'm saying? So I feel like it should have been more incentives like that, yeah.
Thank you. And now we have 2 more minutes. Are there any more questions? Drop them in the chat if you have any questions. And if not, we can wrap it up. So I'll give a few more seconds.
I'd like to say one last thing based on some of the questions real quick, and which was there seemed to be some surprise around pretrial deaths and how much it is. It's actually a little bit less in Louisiana. So from 2000 to 2018, over 86,000 people died behind bars. Okay, that's nationally, 86,000. From 2000 to 2018, approximately 21% of those deaths were pretrial. And so, you know I was presenting mainly on the Louisiana numbers and what we found, but I think the scope of the problem is huge, and it's not just pretrial, but it is also those people who have been convicted and who are serving sentences, but were never sentenced to death. So I just wanted to add that little bit, and to thank you all for having us today.